can make it a little less loud. So I'm going to just begin. My name is Omar Kholeif. I'm the Manilow Senior Curator and Director of Global Initiatives at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. I am also the guest curator of the special section you'll see in Hall 1 called Focus Beyond Territory. And I'm delighted to have with me in conversation Iftikhar Dadi, who is an artist and also a professor at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and UBIK, who is an artist who was formerly based in the United Arab Emirates and now is based in India. The context for this talk emerged from very specifically the ideas behind the focus section, which was about exploring the concept of landscape in the broadest sense, the formal social and political landscape, and how it was exemplified or personified in works of art. And Iftikhar has a collaboration with the Indian artist Nalini Malani, which is in Javeri Contemporary's booth, which actually talks very specifically of this theme of borders. And that became a jumping off point to actually think about what would it mean to have a talk that explored this idea of negotiating borders, particularly between India and Pakistan now, after 70 years of partition. And so we are going, where the format of the talk is going to go, and hopefully the mic will stop acting up. The format of the talk is that Iftikhar is going to present for about 10 minutes, and then UBIK will talk for about 10 minutes. Then I'll be in conversation with them, and then we'll open up for audience Q&A. So please do have your questions ready. And we have a slideshow and lots of things, and I'm very excited to kind of begin.
Thanks so much. Thanks for being here. I wanted to just talk about my life, which is entwined with my practice, and I'm beginning with these images of the partition of South Asia. So the British were in India for several centuries, and after the Second World War, decolonization basically begins in Africa and Asia. India is one of the first places to formally decolonize. And when the British leave in 1947, so India is also split into India and what is, in Pakistan. And in 1971, Pakistan further split into, it used to be West Pakistan and East Pakistan split and became Bangladesh in 1971. So these are maps that you see that give a sense of the kind of the geographic division taking place in 1947. It was attended by a very large migration of people across the borders, one of the largest migrations in human history. And it's also the case that even in 1947, not all the territories were neatly divided between India and Pakistan. So there were areas that were princely states that did not choose sides. There was Kashmir, which was a point of contention. So the settling of borders and the making of these kind of nation states was not a clean affair. And my parents, both my father and my mother, actually belong to different ethnic and language groups in different parts of India, and they migrated to Pakistan, to Karachi, where I grew up after 1947. These are photographs of from the partition showing the kind of violence and displacement taking place. These are photographs by Margaret Burke-White, and many of them are iconic. The work Bloodlines, which is showing right now you can see the work in the Javeri Contemporary booth, it's called Bloodlines, and this is a collaboration between myself and between the Bombay-based artist Nalini Malani. I met Nalini Malani for the first time in 1996. We were both showing in an exhibition in Copenhagen, and when I started speaking with and talking with Nalini, we almost had this kind of a crossed history. So Nalini was actually born in Karachi. But at a young age, she moved to Bombay right after the partition, whereas my father had been based in but moved to Karachi after the partition. And 1997 was the next year, which was the 50th year of both the independence of both India and Pakistan, and also the partition. So in some ways, the independence of India and Pakistan is, supposed to be a celebratory affair, right? I mean, this is the birth of the modern nation state, etc. But it's also a tragedy at the same time, because it was accompanied by division and bloodshed. And we thought that rather than acceding to, or in a sense, listening to the kind of official propaganda that would accompany, the 50 years of partition, of the making of the nation states of India and Pakistan, that we should do something more reflective and thoughtful and critical. And we decided to kind of work together and created this work. The work is the lines of divisions that were drawn in 1947. The lines were drawn by actually a British lawyer who had come, whose speciality was dividing up countries, okay, in the late British Empire. And he spent only 6 weeks in India. He didn't know anything about India. That was his quote-unquote qualification. And his name was Radcliffe. And he drew the line and left, okay, and which enormous consequences for, of course, the people on the ground. So the work is intended to, in a sense, look at this sense of kind of plentitude, which is perhaps kind of evoked by the golden sequence, and but also this kind of this visible red gash, okay, of a line that cuts through this kind of otherwise this continuous field of gold. So the work is on display, and it's hard to photograph the work because it has this reflective aspect. So I encourage you to go and see the work. The other work I wanted to talk about is a work that I've been collaborating with my partner Elizabeth, whom I work with normally as an artist we've been working together for the last 2 decades. And this is also a work that is, that comments on the notion of kind of, I guess, nationalism, okay, but this time looking at emblems of nationalism. So nations have various emblems, flags and etc. But one of the emblems are national flowers. So for example, you see 2 examples here. One is this national flower of Armenia, which is also being, in a sense, used to think about, the question of the Armenian genocide, and the national flower of North Korea, which is the magnolia, which you see on the currency of North Korea, okay. And in the case of Palestine, the Palestinian poppy, which is, which has the colors of red and green, which is it's seen as a symbol of sacrifice in Palestine, is also associated with the colors of the Palestinian flag. So there's a way in which not just the flag but also the flower is associated with a kind of belonging, with nationhood, okay. But in some ways, of course, the flowers are completely arbitrary as well, right? So a flower the hibiscus that grows in perhaps Sudan and has meaning in Sudan might also have meaning and may grow widely elsewhere. So how do you, in a sense, how do kind of, in a sense, nations choose emblems, right, as flowers as emblems, and how do they become, in a sense, they belong to certain peoples and not to others, right? So this is a series of works that ask this question in a kind of a quasi tongue-in-cheek manner. So the hibiscus, the karkade, is Sudan is one of the latest countries to be partitioned. It was partitioned, as you know, into Sudan and South Sudan so recently. So the work is a series of flowers that look at the emblems, these floral emblems of various countries that have had problems, okay? So we've done only 6, but I guess we could cover the whole world. Every place has problems, so we wouldn't need to stop at these. But anyway, so we have the clover from Ireland, and that's the North Korean national flower, the magnolia, and the Palestinian poppy you see here, and the 2 others is the lotus from India, the Padma, and the cocohochil, which is the dahlia from Mexico, which of course, you know, I live in the US and President Trump is now interested in building a wall, okay, as you all know, across the border. So, and the dahlia you can see also at the Jaberi Contemporary booth. So let me stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Iftikhar. I'm going to hand over.
Hi. So yeah, for me, the partition has always been sort of a history lesson. I mean, because I grew up in the south of India, and like Iftikhar pointed out, during this partition of India, there were certain princely states that refused to join or weren't too keen on joining, and you know, and there is actually more violent history down in the south where India has gone in, the Republic of India has gone in and invaded Hyderabad and all of that. So for me, the understanding partition of India only came about after I moved back to Delhi when I was an adult. I'm going to talk more about identities of border and how I had to confront it, and in a way, a cathartic experience was for me to confront it through my passport. And I did this. This was actually my last show in Dubai. Ironically, a farewell show that I did for myself just before I was leaving Dubai. And the whole idea of the work was, the series is called Incidentals, and the whole idea of the work was to just look into my look into like 8 years of my existence in the UAE. I grew up in the UAE almost half my life, but I count the 8 years of my adult life as really important because I returned to the UAE to work, and it was a very different experience from it suddenly changing from home to then becoming a port of call. And this work mostly talks about the trauma associated with border control and having to constantly travel in and out of the country. And so the ways I've represented is there were about, I think, 6 works or 7 works, and 4 of them were basically scanned visas, and this kind of became a self-portrait representation of my time in the UAE. So this was for the first year, the one on the right for the second year, third and the fourth year. And this constant renewal process also, as much as I don't like bringing identity into my work, I was just really forced by a particular country to just keep on bringing my identity and confronting it. And it was quite traumatic in that sense. Even now, I really don't like traveling a lot because airports and immigrations actually really trouble me a lot. Again, coming out from that series of work is these two. Again, these are all actually my real passport pages. The passport expired, so I could use it. And small gestures, like the one on the left, every time I would travel out, the immigration officer would fold the corners of the page so that the next time I come in, it would be easier for him to identify where he'd stamped it. And for me, that was quite a small, while it was a small gesture, it was quite violent at the same time also. And the one on the right, you can't see it clearly, but it's actually a paper. What I did was I folded a paper plane, and then I unfolded it. And the whole idea of the work speaks about my intention to want to fly the plane, my intention, but that invisible lack of documentation that exists while I made the work. And this was really a small farewell show that I wanted to do, mostly to just get rid of my identity before I moved back to India. And I purposely moved back to India because I could be anonymous. In the UAE, it got to a point where I was kind of paranoid about not being anonymous anymore. And strangely enough, being in India, I could afford that. And yeah, this was actually it all started with actually the front page of my passport. When I got it back from my sponsor after a few years, it was this filing cabinet. It was this filing sticker that made me start this work because my identity was reduced to a single letter, H, and I had no idea what this meant, and I wanted to question that a lot. And so yeah, basically this is what the work was about.
So I want to begin by asking you, Iftikhar, about your particular project, and just asking a little bit about how, I mean, basically you and Nalini had these very kind of crossed trajectories. And how did that conversation truly manifest into the work and its form specifically? This idea of working, there's a specific way that the piece was made using sequins and etc. Could you talk about how your conversations about your identity led into the formal aspects of how the work was realized?
Both Nalini and myself have been interested also. My own research has been partly interested in looking at how craft practices transition in ways with industrialization. Nalini has been wrong. Nalini is a more senior artist than I am. In fact, she's currently having a retrospective at the Pompidou Center. And so she came from more of an experience of being an artist than I'm younger to her, and also coming out of an art practice that was very much based on drawing and painting. But in this case, we thought that it would be interesting to, because we were collaborating, and we also wanted to think about questions of displacements that were not just in a sense spatial, but also economic. And one of the things we wanted to do was to collaborate or to work with people who actually make this work, who do embroidery work, on a commercial basis. So the work is actually made in Karachi. So it was made in Karachi to, in a sense, to realize the piece. So it's thinking about questions of collaborations, not just between myself and another artist or between the two of us, but also thinking about a kind of, let's say, participation or collaboration or whatever with other people. So,
and then with the flowers, there is this kind of ebullient radiation that comes from the light. And I was very particularly intrigued or curious about whether they were celebratory or not, because in a way, in the booth here, you see the Mexican flower, and behind it is this piece that's about partition, and in a way, it's very poignant because it feels like this kind of meditation on the violence of borders. But there's something about the flower's kind of ebullient shine that is celebratory, but it also represents some, in the cases of some of these countries that you've articulated, and all of them have had some issue with borders, whether it's Ireland and the division of Ireland, or whether, could you talk to me a little bit about this, the form and the kind of ebullient nature of the work and the lighting, and the kind of implicit political connotations that are embedded within the work?
Yeah. So the flower. So we are, if you see the dahlia, there's one being shown. But the best way to see these works is to see more than one together. So they create fields of light, right? So a flower is supposed to be kind of the small, delicate, organic, form. But then these are 4 feet, across. So they're kind of industrial. They're hard. There is this artifice about them. There's a kind of an artificiality in terms of its light, in terms of its form. They are both kind of refer to floor, to the flower, but they're also kind of hard industrial signage, right? Which is both mesmerizing and I would say slightly creepy, at the same time. Okay, so it's intended to evoke the kind of the siren call of nationalism in all of its complicated ways.
And for me, it was very. When I went to the Grand Mosque this week, I'd never been, I started to think about these flowers and all the floral decoration within the Grand Mosque and thought, what if these were all the flowers of all these different partitioned places of all of their borders? Wouldn't that be just perfect? UBIK, I wanted to talk to you about your work because in a way it's kind of, there's an inverse. Is your mic working? Maybe we could borrow Iftikhar's. There's a kind of inverse in that here we're looking at a kind of macro idea around borders and representations and metaphors, but you kind of collapse that into very kind of personal identitarian politics. And you mentioned to me before this that one of the things that you've been constantly, or during the talk, one of the things you've been constantly trying to do is to kind of somehow erase or erode or displace your identity within the work. And could you talk to us a little bit about that tension, perhaps?
I mean, yeah, like, because I started my practice in Dubai, this was about 8 years ago, and a lot of it, when I started making work, people were more curious to know where I was from rather than the work. And the reason why I don't use my real name when I make work is I really didn't want to attach a specific geography to my work. And as it is, it's quite evident that I'm Indian when people look at me, and then they want to know more about me, and then they want to, and then I didn't want to make that connection just because I'm Indian, that my work should be Indian kind of a thing, and I've always been against it. And ironically, now that I've also moved back to India, I strangely enough face the same kind of criticism also out there, because people do say that there's nothing Indian about your work, and I don't understand that. I've always been, and I guess it's also because of, it's mostly me being a product of being a child of a migrant. My dad came here when he was in the late 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and for me, Dubai and India have weekly been home and moving abroad, and also having grown up in boarding school, so there was really no fixed notion of a place for me, and no notion of belonging. And while for some it was disturbing, for me it was actually quite relieving in that sense. It's quite, for me, I embraced that a lot more. And I still embrace it. I still like being free of an identity in that sense.
Well, you talk about this concept of home, and in this particular work is kind of very specifically talking about the impossibility of representing or attaching yourself to a particular home. And could you talk a little bit about, this idea of what it means to feel this kind of constant sense of displacement, which you articulate this idea of feeling like your work should perform a specific function in either context. And how then do you create a sense of home in either place? And how has that displacement not only affected your work, but your own identity, perhaps?
I mean, it's quite hard. Like I always tell people, if you carefully look at my work, there's always a sense of belonging. You would know where it comes from. Like I primarily also work a lot with red oxide. Now I do that because my dad was a fabricator in the UAE, and I grew up with that particular material. But I necessarily don't want to tell that story. I don't want to tell the story of my father through the material. I've always been against it. I would much rather tell the experience of growing up with the material minus my father's experiences out there. Because A, it's personal, and B, I don't want to drag in his lived experience into my lived experience. There's a big difference out there. What he went through is not what I'm going through. And with most of my work, I mean, at this point also, it's kind of strange. Every time I travel in India, if I'm traveling from Delhi to Bangalore or anywhere else, I still often carry my passport. It's a force of habit that's kind of come out from being in the UAE. And I often get mocked about it also. There have been so many times that I show my passport at immigration control in India. And I remember the first time I was traveling, I was actually taken aback when I moved back to India. And I was going to Kochi, and I remember going out of the airport, and I kind of panicked because I didn't go through immigration. And I kind of completely forgot about that idea of not having to go through immigration, or not having to be answerable to when am I going to return and all of that. And that was quite a liberating experience for me at that point of time. I don't mind the displacement. Even now, I'm quite displaced in where I live in Delhi. I'm constantly moving around. Probably I'm going to shift next year, and I'm going to come back to Delhi. But yeah, I like shifting. I don't mind the displacement. I actually enjoy it. It helps me understand myself better, and yeah.
And it obviously plays into the work as well.
It plays into my work also. I mean, and ironically, I actually picked up these works yesterday from Dubai. I assumed it was with me, but then when I went back to Laurie, I showed this in Laurie Shabibi, and when I went back to visit them, they mentioned that this work was here, and I was quite taken aback. So it was kind of interesting. I actually picked up these works physically, and then I gave it to my gallerist, and even he was surprised. He was like, "Wait, I thought you had it," and I said, well, even I thought I had it, but I didn't even bother picking them up. I completely gave up.
The works were displaced also. But one thing that a question for both of you, and to kind of lead into our conversation, is you did talk about this idea of the expectation that you perform an idea of Indianness, or that there's an Indian, whether it's formal aesthetic or conceptual technique, that should play into your work. And one of the things about the notion of the South Asian subcontinent is that there's this idea that there should be, in some circles, especially in the West, that there should be a kind of formal unification of things that make something of the subcontinent. But of course, as we know, the subcontinent is incredibly heterogeneous. There are issues around movement and throughout the region, and I wondered if you could both speak to that idea. Maybe Iftikhar, you could go first about this idea of performing a kind of work, but also this notion of the South Asian subcontinent being the expectation of it performing a particular function in the world of Western art, perhaps.
So I mean, yeah. So South Asia is, 1.5 billion people or more, right? It's got many spoken and written languages, many religions, many different kinds of peoples, right? So it's incredibly diverse, and also the fact that in its modern history, the last 50, 70 years, the relations between the nation states that crystallized, in the last 60, 70 years, have not always had good relations between them. This is particularly the case, for example, between Pakistan and India. So it makes it hard for people to travel. So when I was living in Karachi in the 90s. One of the very nice things for me was to meet people like Nalini. We met in Copenhagen, but then we decided to work together, even though we were living across these borders. In 1997, there was another exhibition called Mappings. That was the beginning of a new kinds of connections enabled by artist residencies. So there was the Khoj residency, which was founded in India, which I attended the first Khoj residency. And then there are residencies now in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan. So what has happened is that despite the difficulties of, let's say, getting visas and traveling easily, in fact, you've had very good artists have become friends, curators have become friends. They've done projects together despite difficulties. I think places like the UAE are very important because this is a very important site for South Asians. It's for me to meet UBIK for the first time in Abu Dhabi. So I think these things should not be minimized. And for artists especially, I think that for artists from South Asia, they need to at least have a voice of conscience. Okay, it's not to fall into jingoism. It's to really see the kind of the larger stakes involved in thinking about. I mean, we all follow our own practice, but we should also, I think, be mindful, okay, of these larger kind of, let's say, political stakes that try to slot us into kind of narrow identitarian kind of ways of thinking. And regarding the the relation between the West and South Asia, of course, there are. I mean, the Western world is, the Western art institutions have certain agendas. On the other hand, I teach in the West, I teach at Cornell, I've been involved in also a bit of curating and so on. I think what the art institutions in the Western world are also looking for is that, I mean, if there isn't research that's done, if there isn't knowledge that's already available, then it's hard for them to begin and do all that research. So I think one of the things that all of us can do is to enable the artists, the movements, to be in a sense better researched and better known, so that these artists can then be seen as artists, both in terms of their individual capacity and also their relation to place, but not in kind of reductive ways. So,
I mean, yeah, like Iftikhar said, it's places like the UAE act as a neutral place for Indians and Pakistanis to meet, and it's not just the visual arts in India. It also affects all forms of art, be it film, be it theater, be it music, and I remember just before we spoke, Iftikhar was saying geopolitics is mostly based on what's happening at that point of time in India and the passport and then the issues with that. Like I personally have met more Pakistani artists being in the UAE than I have in India, and I really respect artists from Pakistan. I think they have really strong practice, and it's really interesting. And for me, at this stage, I actually wish there were more Pakistani artists who were allowed to come into the country to interact with, because I think it's really important dialogue to have. But right now, there are so many artists, there's so many peers of mine who aren't aware of Pakistani artists and what they do, what they're doing across the border out there. And so I think that's a big loss, actually.
A follow-up question is, maybe to go macro a little bit, we're 70 years from partition, And could you both speak to, in your own ways, how 70 years on, how partition between India and Pakistan and this formal decolonization process, how that affects, you've touched upon that a little bit, how that affects day-to-day life socially and politically, but also how it creates perceptions or ideas. From my perspective, there is an over-dominance, for example, of Indian art in the international context when we talk about South Asia. That's one observation of mine, but perhaps you could both respond to that in your own ways or your own experience.
I'll go first. So India is, of course, much larger, right? India is by far the larger country. It's also the case that, if you go to Delhi or Bombay, you have any number of, curators and visitors who are visiting India, right? So there's a way in which Indian artists have both had, the fact that they inhabit a larger country and that there's more institutional development in India, as well as there is more exposure of Indian artists to the outside. I think what's really, what's happening now with some initiatives such as the Dhaka Art Summit in Dhaka, then there's a couple of biennial projects in Lahore and Karachi. Sri Lanka, I think, has a very interesting art scene. And I just think these art scenes and these artists both need to talk to each other, but also there needs to be institutional development and more visibility, in that respect. And I think things are changing. I mean, the way things were in the 20 years ago, we are kind of in a very different world. But I hope but it's certainly not a world that is, it needs far more kind of work and exposure and knowledge, definitely.
I mean, in India right now, nationalism and jingoism is quite high. And it's quite nauseating also at this moment. I do agree with Iftikhar. I wish there were more institutions collaborating with each other around this thing, but it's not. It's really become India really dominating the scene in terms of South Asian art. India is really dominating the scene. And politically also, I personally actually prefer Pakistani artists when they make political work, and because of the conflict that they go through, and that's in the other side of the border, their works are a lot more stronger. And in India, I don't think artists are addressing the issues as strong as possible. And also I was quite nauseated by this whole notion of 70 years of independence, because every time when you talk about partition, it's always co-opted by the north of India. And then there's this very clear, evident divide between the north and the south. And it's almost come to a point that when they talk about partition and the history of India, there is no mention of the south at all. It's almost as if the south is completely invisible. And I mean, I really don't care, but sometimes it really affects you, because on one hand, living in Delhi, on one hand, they force you to acknowledge the partition, but on the other hand, they actually are quite racist to you and actually just bring down your whole identity to being from one state. It's a colloquial, common racist thing for most North Indians to address a South Indian as a Madrasi, which is actually calling them from saying that they're from the state of Tamil Nadu, which is and the capital city, which is Madras. But I mean, obviously that's not the case, right? But then they just bring it down to that. And it has a lot to do with also the far-right government that we have in place in India right now. They're using the border in some really strange, they're evoking border sentiment and nationalism in some really strange arguments. And most of it is the argument of the unknown soldier fighting in the border, defending your country. And that's always thrown at the general public and as a propaganda as you should be taking all the you should be able to sacrifice standing in a queue in an ATM just so that because there's a soldier on the border defending your right to do that. And that argument doesn't make any sense. But at any point, any notion, it's a very interesting argument that the far-right government uses quite often, the rhetoric. And yeah.
Another point that Iftikhar that you raised was notions of, or when we were talking about the Western context, was lack of infrastructure and lack of literature and art historical research and literature. And I'm hoping you can talk to us a little bit about what actually exists in terms of trying to create a canonical genealogical sense of what happened in South Asia during and against the social and political changes, and in terms of what's missing, what are the roots, what are the things that need to be done to make sure that that history is offered?
Yeah. So I think here a number of people can play a role. So if we look at, let's say, modern South Asia, 20th century to the present, then there are many, there are some areas that have been relatively well researched. Others are still, need work. For example, if you look at Bangladesh, for example, a few artists have had good monographs published. But for the most part, if you just read English, you'll have a hard time kind of understanding, really getting an overview of, what was happening in Bangladesh. The same, I would say, is the case with Sri Lanka. So people know the 43 group to some degree, which were, which was a group of very interesting modernists. But then what happened after the 43 group, it's very hard to figure out. So I think this is a place where many people can play a role. People doing their masters and PhDs, curators who are putting together shows of these areas can engender research. Institutions, in these countries, it's not, it needs. One person can't do it. It needs really this kind of a group effort. But really, I think what I can stress is that there is an urgency to doing this research and this project in multiple ways. I think that's what is important to do.
I mean, one of the things that I find sometimes problematic is that the only written text about, for example, a work of art, especially in the modern period, tends to be seen in auction house catalogs, for example, like by Sotheby's and Christie's. And a lot of people use those as reference points about works and then quote them and use them. And often the information can be incorrect or factually incorrect or not contextualized. And that's just an observation that I've seen that indicates a kind of lack of information around some of this context. But to move, we're of course, as we know, we were in Abu Dhabi, but we're in the UAE and we're in the GCC. And one of the things that I've been particularly interested in is the relationship between South Asia and West Asia, let's say, or the Middle East and South Asia, the concept of the Manasa. Can either of you talk a little bit, both of you talk a little bit about this idea of the kind of cross-pollination between these so-called two, what some people see as two independent regions, but arguably could be seen as one, in terms of movements of artists, in terms of movements of ideas, genealogies, styles of practice, etc. I don't know who wants to go first, Iftikhar.
Yeah, no, this is a kind of an important question that deserves a longer answer, but I'll try to be brief. Well, so historically speaking, of course, there have been, in a sense, what we think of the world, the way it's mapped today, if we think of the Middle East or we think of, subcontinent or South Asia, then these are basically Cold War contexts, right? But when we think in a longer, deeper history, then we think about, there was all sorts of trade, for example, between places like Oman and Balochistan, for example, right? So, or the work that the group Camp has done to look at, contemporary kind of shipping, but which has resonances to older. So there's ways in which the geography we understand today was not the geography, of deep time, let's say, right? And but even in recent era, we've had first of all there are common experiences, I would say. So the common experiences would be experiences of decolonization, of infrastructural lack, of the encounter with modernity and the need for artists to kind of take that seriously, right? And in specific terms that have been, one can trace also exchanges. So you can take I mean, UBIK is a good example of somebody, kind of a living example, if I may say, of somebody who's, physically and bodily made that kind of a transition. So I think these are all important kind of valences to look at. A recent area that is emerging of kind of research is what might be called south to south exchanges, or exchanges that don't necessarily take London, Paris, and New York as the centers of of notes, but that there were other notes as well, right? And I think that's important to continue to push in that direction.
I mean, for me, I mean, when it comes to kind of an exchange, I can only think of Camp, who actually has done a lot more work connecting with that side of the world. But also Coach has also started programming, and Coach started programming a lot about Africa because the area where Coach is in Delhi, a lot of African nationals live there, and the programming is interesting because they have this particular project that revolves and is mainly built for the African nationals who live in that area. So there aren't many artists and there aren't many collectives doing work across, and I wish they were. And even if they were looking into that region, it's still a very superficial idea of it. There's nothing deep. There's no deep research happening. Coach is probably one of the pioneers, I would say, who are actually looking in that direction as of now. And there are some very interesting projects coming out of there also.
So we have 10 minutes left, and I wanted to open up to any of your questions. There should be a roving microphone somewhere here for freestanding mic for questions. So if you just raise your hand, someone will bring you the mic, which would be great if you could use that.
And maybe wave your hand because it's very hard to see.
Yeah, you're all shrouded in darkness. We don't even know.
The question is for UBIK. In terms of the display of your work, I noticed that you have some that are hung up like they're on paper and they're with clips. And others is just like a normal, I don't know, a standardized wood, where it's just kind of like the passport is floating or whatnot. But is it dealing with like this routine, mechanical nature of dealing with like, you know, I don't know, government production of the works, or like how do you put thought into terms of how you display your works?
It depends on the material. Actually, the paperclip was an advice I actually got from Omar, who's actually here. And I remember asking him, why do you never frame your work? And I think this is one of the interesting things he told me. Is like, it's paper, let the material do what it has to do. And that I thought was really good advice. And he was it's quite right. Sometimes you have to let the material express itself also. You can't force it too much also. And so I usually, when I make work, I usually let the material figure out the installation in its own way. I don't like framing much. Nowadays, I don't frame my work at all. That's one of the very few works that I've actually framed, the ones you see, the passports. And that I wanted to frame it because I purposely wanted to show I wanted it to be an object, and I wanted it to be a delicate object in that sense. But with the passport, with the visa scans, I didn't want it to be that delicate because when I was making the visa scans, I actually thought about it as a self-portrait because of all those typing centers in the UAE. And the amount of scans, initially I wanted to collect scans of other people's visas. But then I kind of felt intrusive about it, and I said, I think the best way to confront it would have been to use my own visas. And no, but like with the paperclip thing, it was actually an interesting suggestion by Umar, and I've been following it ever since. Anytime I use paper now, I do that. Plus, it's really cost effective and it's easier.
Do we have another question? I see a hand raised over here.
Hi, I have a question for UBIK actually. Going back to what you said about not feeling anonymous at the airport and being irritated at travel, I was wondering if you've ever taken the step to ask what the symbols mean, what the H means, and what some numbers on boarding passes sometimes? And if you think that pursuing that information can feed into the artwork or like the continuation of that work?
Well, I actually found out what the H was much later after I did the project. It turns out it was actually the first name of my sponsor's father's name, because I used to work for her company. I'm not going to name the company, but I used to work for her company. That was and it was filed under that. So, and it was both comforting and disturbing to know that, because I realized that there would have been so many H's. There would have been so many passports that had the same letter there, in that sense. Like I said, this was the first and the only work I made that actually confronted an identity, a personal work in that sense. This is probably one of the most personal works in my whole entire catalog of works that I've ever done. And it was something I just wanted to do and get it over with, because of all my years in Dubai, I've never made a work about my identity. But just as I was leaving Dubai, I said, you know what, maybe I should finally just do it and get it over with. It was both a conscious decision and in a way, very cathartic, selfish work in some sense. I wanted to glorify my time in Dubai. You know, I wanted to feel good about it.
Any more questions? There's a hand up there, yeah.
Hi, Iftikhar. I was looking at the flowers and I actually didn't know the political context to them and I'd seen images before. And I was actually connecting the material to the work you did in the 90s when you were in Karachi, when you were looking at the pop culture and the kitsch culture. I wanted to know if there was any connection because the materials, especially the one that when you were doing with the trucks and the neon lights.
Yeah, so I've been along with other artists and along with others, but have been engaging with with what we might call popular culture for a long time. So in some sense, you can think of these works also at, I guess, standing at the intersection of kind of pop art and conceptual art. I don't know, it's a kind of a strange intersection, but it's both relies on or kind of in a sense participates in kind of popular signage and so on, but then also has this kind of a disjunctive concept behind it, I guess. So and that's it's kind of representative of the way I work, and I collaborate with Elizabeth. So we've been working in this way for some time. But having said that, the notion of pop or popular in South Asia is it itself a kind of something that needs unpacking, right? Because pop is, when we think of American pop art, we think really of its relation to commodity culture, right? We think of Andy Warhol and the Campbell soup can or something like that, or the Marilyn Monroe, which is a commodified kind of image of celebrity. But the popular in South Asia also has these other valences, right? Which includes those, but also includes kind of this weird traffic with what might be considered to be kind of folk cultures or authentic cultures, but which have become mediatized, right? So in other words, but also informal economies, right? So people in so there's the formal economy, but that's actually quite small, right? But it's the informal economy which is much larger, where people live and work. So there's a way in which the popular also begins to kind of, in a sense, has these, kind of meanings that bleed into economics, into kind of society, as well as into aesthetics. So as an artist, I'm very interested in thinking about and inhabiting that terrain. Thank you for the question.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has one. There's a hand raised up here.
A short question. I'm curious what decolonization means to both of you, both personally and in your practices, and also what a place like the UAE, which doesn't have its own colonial history and baggage, it was colonized to some degree, but not really part of the empire in that way. So I'm curious, what that looks like both personally in your practices, and also what a place like this means for that. That makes sense?
So no, again, thank you for a very rich question. So decolonization is of course something that we can speak at length about. But so there's formal decolonization, which we talked about. Let's say in the case of India and Pakistan, it would be 1947. Okay, in the case of Bangladesh, it would be 1971, right? In the sense that Bangladesh traces its independence to 1971, and then you have places that were actually never formally colonized or never formally decolonized. So there's a political genealogy, right? But then apart from that, there's also the genealogy of selfhood, of belonging, of identity, of culture that doesn't actually coincide very well or completely neatly, okay, with the political timeline. And I see kind of this cultural decolonization. But it's not simply decolonization which is recovering the past, but it's also charting a new future, right? So it's also something that is that is a kind of an encounter with the unexpected, right? Which is both technological, which is both social, which is both cultural at the same time. So I think decolonization is both a kind of a forward and backward movement at the same time, and it has to be in that way. And to what degree it ties with kind of, let's say, political events it of course has ties to, we all live in history and are shaped by political realities and events around us, but I would say that consciousness also has its own temporalities and delays and leaps into the past as well as the future. So I think that's a more interesting way, in my opinion, to look at decolonization, at least as an artist.
Yeah, I mean, so what's interesting in India right now is that a lot of people are also talking about, I mean, decolonization in terms of caste and in terms of class also. There's quite a resurgence of the Dalit movement. The Dalits are basically the lowest caste in Indian society, and there's a lot of resurgence of Dalit movement coming back, and a lot of people are basically talking about decolonizing caste and a lot of people are questioning also post-colonial theory, because most of the academics were of upper class and upper caste also when they wrote it. So a lot of people are actually questioning that. It's just a recent new debate that's been happening in India, amongst the academic circles. But and it's kind of fascinating also, because part of this conversation is also happening from DBA activists outside of India, mostly from the West, and they're actually fueling it and looking at the decolonization and through mostly, again, it's also women who are doing it. So it's mostly a feminist idea of decolonization, but it's also interesting. A lot of the fight is between Indian feminists who are upper class and upper caste versus DBA feminists who are basically in the West and in India, and them questioning post-colonial theories put forward and stuff like that. So I think that's a very fascinating debate, but it's also getting quite mucky, and at this stage it's just mostly name-calling at this stage.
Well, I think that was an incredibly rich conversation. There's obviously so much more to unpack, and I hope that you will investigate the work of both of these artists, which deals in both explicit ways, but also in sensitive and more subtle ways with the theme of negotiating borders. Please do visit Javeri Contemporary's booth in the focus section, where you can see the two works that Iftikhar was talking about. And I would just want to take a moment to thank all of you for being with us, and Iftikhar and UBIK for flying all the way to be here with us and to join me in this conversation. So thank you so much.